So let's have a look at the mobile technology landscape. Now, one of the things about mobile is if you want to understand it, you do need to know what's going on in the technology. So you will see that we have this kind of divided market. You have the smartphones and you have the feature phones. And the big change really with smartphones came when Apple launched their iPhone. This was the point at which we suddenly had a real convergent device. In other words, this thing in your pocket could potentially do anything you wanted, anything you expected from your device. But it's also important to remember that the other side of it are the feature phones. These are the more basic phones. Having said that, today's feature phone was probably the smartphone of 5 years ago. But nonetheless, people with feature phones will tend not to do the things you expect with smartphones. So they tend not to browse the mobile web. They tend not to download apps. And it's a much more basic use of the device. And what you will find is that in any market, feature phones are also an important element. So currently we have around 50% smartphone penetration, so that means at least half the people in the UK have a more basic phone. The growth of mobile has come through, well, the very first mobile devices were actually invented in the 1890s. A Kentucky melon farmer came up with the first mobile phone. It had to be towed behind a horse, it was so big. But it really started to move forwards in the 1980s, and that was when you had the brick phones. And it was essentially just about getting phone calls through. The biggest change started to happen when we have the 2G era. It's when we went digital, and we were able, and included in that digital was SMS. Now, for those of you who want to know about the history of SMS, this was not an accident. It was something that was built into the system. But nobody ever expected it to take off in the way that it did. It was originally designed as something for people to just send messages, so you've missed a call, send an out-of-office reply. But what happened was that by the turn of the millennium, teenagers particularly started picking up because it was a fast, rapid medium. And that filtered through to everyone else. And now we're all using text, and actually in the UK, we send more text now than we actually make voice calls. Then, round about the millennium, we moved into the 3G era. And this was all about data. So it was all about being able to connect to the internet, to have content, to have music, to have video, and the voice side of it, the phone calls, is just one small part of the mix. Now, looking ahead, we have the 4G era. In the UK, we're a little bit behind the rest, some other territories. So, for example, in the US, they've already had 4G standard for a year. There aren't that many phones, and they're still rolling it out. In the UK, we won't be getting 4G at this rate until probably the beginning of 2014 in practice. And once you get 4G, then you're talking about extremely fast connections to the internet, and suddenly data is no longer a problem, and you can stream anything you like to a mobile device. One of the biggest growths we've seen in the last few years has been the mobile internet. And a lot of that has been about the browsers. When the mobile internet first came out, it was something called WAP. And essentially that was a stripped-down version of the internet that ran on phones. But the usability, the UX was very poor. But with the advent of the iPhone and other smart devices and touch screens, suddenly the mobile internet has really begun to move forward. A lot of brands have got into the mobile internet. The predictions are that it will actually overtake by 2013. The other great success with the smartphone, and this has very much been led by the iPhone, are mobile apps. Apple did not invent the app. They've existed in a primitive form for some years. But it was the development of the App Store, and also, as much as anything else, the economics behind the App Store that has allowed them to actually take off. And we've now seen over 15 billion apps downloaded onto Apple phones. And we're also seeing the development of things like Google Market, which is seeing a similar level of interactivity. One of the big questions at the moment is apps versus web. So brands will come along and say, well, should we be doing app? Should we be doing the web? Well, obviously the thing about apps is that they give you a native experience. So you can do a lot of rich content that is built into the device. You can cache information so that it can actually be used away from an internet connection. And it particularly suits some demographics. So Apple users love apps. They download a lot of them. With the mobile web, it's simpler and it can potentially work across all devices. It's much more universal. Although it is possible through some of the emerging technologies, such as HTML5 to cache content, it doesn't do it so well. It doesn't run as easily. And asking people to enter a URL or a search is often the most significant way in which people find mobile sites. And then with apps themselves, you have that debate about whether it's going to be free or paid. So let's address the paid apps. There is nothing wrong with a paid app for a brand. Generally, they don't do it, but some of the brand owners, those who own content, who own media, actually charging for them can often be a better idea. So, for example, The Guardian, who initially charged for their app, people downloaded it, they valued it, and 50% of their users were reading through that app every day. But obviously the main area that we've seen is in things like gaming with Angry Birds, and particularly the freemium model. So generally, brands who are delivering service will need to be delivering a free app. And there are a number of ways in which you can deliver free apps. So it includes ad-funded content, or you can just do it as part of your service. One of the big changes of the last few years has been the importance of mobile operating systems. Back in 2000, when 3G first appeared, people didn't make their choice on the mobile operating system. They would make the choice by the style of the phone, maybe the manufacturer. But when the iPhone came out, it created a war of mobile operating systems. Apple showed the way that it could differentiate. Whilst we've seen the rise of the iPhone, Android has really taken off, and it's been adopted by many manufacturers, of which the largest are HTC and Samsung. And conversely, Symbian has fallen away. Nokia are now discontinuing their support for Symbian and are now working with Microsoft, and we'll expect to see a rise in the number of users with Microsoft OS in the next few years. One of the big changes we've seen in the last few years is the introduction of the tablet. Once again, Apple changed the market. They did not invent the tablet, but what they did is they brought out the iPad, which was essentially the killer device, the thing that everybody wanted. Initially, I think the public, and particularly when it comes to brand marketing, people find it difficult to know what to do with the tablet. Is it just a big mobile phone? Is it just a small PC? But what we've actually seen as it grows is it's quite different to a mobile device. Although the iPad uses the same operating system, iOS, as an iPhone, it's used in a very different way. And therefore, for brands, the engagement needs to be different. What's particularly interesting about the iPad is the way that we see these different behaviors. So, again, Apple themselves saw it very much as a magazine reader. So the main use of the tablet is that people are watching television and they're browsing at the same time. Now, a lot of television producers assume that you are glued to their program. But of course, people are not. We're on our tablets, we're looking stuff up on the internet, you might check IMDb to find out a film, but more importantly, we're using it for social interaction, so Facebook and particularly Twitter. And we've seen the growth of hashtag TV, and that's undoubtedly being fueled by smartphones, but particularly the tablet device. The other big shift that we're seeing right now is the introduction of HTML5. So this is a new standard for delivering web content. Until the introduction of HTML5, if you wanted to view more interactive content, so video, games, and so on, it had to be delivered through Flash. Now, think about Flash as it sits as an extra layer on top of the browser. And most importantly, Apple refused to support it within iOS. So anyone with an iPhone or an iPad couldn't actually, and still can't, see any Flash sites. The thing about HTML5 is it's actually built within the technology itself, so it's seamless, and it allows us to do all the kinds of things that Flash can do, and a lot more. So it can actually cache things. And suddenly we're getting to this point where web can now become more like an app. And we're talking about web apps. So the definition of what is web, what is an app, will become increasingly blurred. But it's important not to forget good old messaging. And that is still very much the driver of mobile marketing. The best way to think about SMS is as the same way as email is to online. Sometimes with email, it is the campaign. Sometimes it's just a means of notification. Sometimes it's part of the service. So SMS and MMS, picture messaging, have a really important role for doing that. They can be the call to action, they can be the response mechanism, it can be the trigger. So it's still very important, and we are continuing to see a growth of SMS. And although that is slowing down, nonetheless it is very significant. It's something that all users, whether it be a smartphone or a feature phone, can actually access through their handsets.